Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. 4 years ago, I sat down with Bryan Paterson at the beginning of his second term as mayor of the city of Kingston, Ontario. He's back after having been recently re-elected for an unprecedented third term. For this episode, I have invited him to join me for a conversation not only about his ongoing dedication to municipal politics, but also his keen passion to address some of the important issues that impact communities and their citizens, not only here, but just about anywhere: housing, homelessness, and climate change. And those are just but a few. Here is my chat with Mayor Bryan Paterson. Bryan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be back. Hard to believe it's been a few years since we did this. It's amazing how time flies, but and how much has changed probably since the last time we chatted.
Exactly. So, belated congratulations on your re-election for a third term.
Thank you. Well, it's I have to say that this is the most interesting job I've ever had. I'm very, very happy to be in the role, but it's also amazing how much the role has changed. Just how much municipal government has changed. The issues we're dealing with the city have changed. And so, believe it or not, after 8 years in the job, I don't in any way feel that, every day faced with a new challenge, learn something new. And I think that keeps things fresh and exciting, but also make sure I'm always giving everything I got in this job.
I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about why you decided to get into municipal politics in the first place. What was your passion to get into this job?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've always been interested in politics, like from a distance. I think back to, when I first came to Kingston, I was a graduate student at Queen's. And then it was really when I was hired on as a faculty member at RMC. That was really the crossing the threshold from a temporary resident of Kingston to, okay, now I'm, for all intents and purposes, Kingston is definitely now home. And I think out of that, you just start to take more of an ownership of your community and you start to follow the issues more closely. And, I think because I already had a political interest, that I started to follow city council and of the day and trying to see the issues and the challenges that were going on at the time. And I remember very quickly that, the council at the time, I didn't feel necessarily had the vision for economic development and growth that I thought was important. And there were definitely some people around the table that did, but I remember thinking, maybe there would be value having somebody with an economics background at council. So that actually was basically the starting point, the genesis of this kind of idea that, well, maybe I should take a run rather than just sitting back and, being an armchair quarterback. What if I'd sort of dove into the ring? And I think the other piece is that I love being an academic. That's obviously my full-time career, but I was always a little bit concerned about kind of the ivory tower effect, that I would always be, doing research, but very much, removed from the on the ground reality of how you actually make a difference and help build a community and create opportunities for people. So I think it was really a combination of those things. Basically led me to kind of throw my hat in the ring. That was back in 2010, as a complete political rookie, having absolutely no background and no idea what I was doing. That started me down the road that I'm on now.
I've spoken to a few different academics along the way, and one of the messages that seems to permeate these discussions is that, okay, you can do the research into economics, and people can sit back and try to figure out what it is you've been doing as a professor of economics, but it's the ability for you and others like you to communicate what you're doing. To the general public who may not be aware of the subtleties of economics.
Yeah.
Or politics, for that matter.
That is so true. I mean, I think that there is something about a premise of an ability to communicate your knowledge your expertise and your research to people that have absolutely no background in your field whatsoever. And if you can't communicate that, that's not the fault of your listeners. That's up to you to do that. And I think that, fortunately, I think I learned that earlier on in economics. Economics, it's actually a bit of a cutthroat field academically, because you really do have to defend your work, and there are always people that are questioning why your work has value, and you really have to work hard at explaining to others why it does. But I think then out of that, being able to explain it not only to somebody that has the same knowledge of you, but somebody like, sometimes I test their stuff with my wife and my family. They have no academic background in economics, and so if I can make my research seem interesting to them, then I know that I've hit on something.
I want to talk about some of the issues that City Council is dealing with, but one of the things I found interesting is that when you were reelected for a third term, you apparently are the first person to be elected for a third term in the City of Kingston.
So I think I think there may have been one previous mayor that was elected for 3 terms, but those terms were shorter back in the 80s. So I do believe that that I would be on track, I believe, to be the longest serving mayor in Kingston's history, because now the terms are longer. They're 4 years apiece. I mean, I think that's why I'm the 96th mayor. It used to be that the terms for being a mayor, believe it or not, back in the 19th century were only 1-year terms. I can't imagine the amount of work would be involved with that. And then I think they moved to 2-year terms and then to 3-year terms, I think I think that must have been in the 80s, and then they moved to 4-year terms. So it's, it's hard. On the one hand, it's hard to believe that I've been in this role for 8 years and now looking at another 4. On the other hand, it feels like it's gone by in a flash. So I think that, the most interesting part is just, the people that you interact with, the things that you learn, and how things change. Because honestly, this city is very different now than it was 8 years ago. And I've had to adapt too. If the city changes, that means I need to change as well. If I'm still doing things the same way, then there's probably a problem.
I've been living here since 1966. So I've noticed a little bit of change in that particular time frame. Let's talk about a few of the issues. Sure. Third term, you've got a new council, you've got 8 rookies around the horseshoe, which I think hasn't happened before.
Never.
I'd like to get your viewpoint on what you're passionate about in terms of the issues and how you think City Council can impact some of these issues. And I've just chosen a few, and we'll see how many we get to in the interests of time. But let's talk about housing. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to separate people wanting to buy a house versus people needing to rent some sort of place to live.
Sure.
Let's talk about the buying of a house. These issues, in my mind, relate to communities all across the province, across the country, around the world. City councils are facing the same sorts of issues as it relates to housing. And if you want people to live in your town, you've got to be able to help provide them with a place to live. And let's use an example of using up a big chunk of space that was sitting vacant for a while. And in the interests of those folks who don't live in Kingston, I'm talking about a parcel of land that's behind one of the big malls at the west end of town, behind the Riocan Mall, which is what the mall is called. And I heard that there were 1,000, I don't know if it's units or people that will eventually be moving in there. And it has houses, apartment buildings, school, nursing home. And I don't know if there's anything else in that mix. There's retail in there as well.
So apartment building, everything from a rental apartment building to homes available for people to purchase. So a big mix of housing, for sure.
How does this relate? I gather at some particular point, City Council gets involved in zoning and all that sort of thing. What do you see as the role of council in terms of trying to provide affordable housing that people want to or are able to spend money on? In the context of finding bits and pieces of land that you can use for that purpose.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I guess I would bring an economist lens to this issue, because when there's a big demand for housing, which is what we're seeing now. And quite frankly, that demand is not going away. When you look at the population growth that's projected for the province, for the country as a whole, the growth pressure that we're seeing right now, it's if anything, it may even accelerate in the years to come. So the only way that you can curb big increases in house prices, you've got to make sure that the supply of new housing coming onto the market is able to keep up with that demand. That's just
inventory.
That's inventory. Absolutely. It's one of those, laws of economics, and you don't have to like it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't hold. And so I think that, it's a concerted effort to make sure that we are constantly bringing on new zoned land and opportunities for new development projects. So sometimes that's what we call the greenfield, which is basically just, it's land that's never been developed, and we can then bring it in and zone it, and then work with development partners to build, whether it's single family homes or townhouses or apartment buildings. Sometimes it's what we call brownfield, which is basically the land that you just gave an example of. There used to be a factory on that land, and unfortunately, after many years of that factory, it actually contaminated some of the soil, and so we actually have a program that actually helps to assist with the cleanup of that soil, making sure that it can now be developed for a very different purpose, in this case, residential housing. And sometimes it's a matter of repurposing buildings that are already there. We've got some historic buildings in the city. One of them is the prison for women that has been empty for 2 decades, and now finally we've got a proposal to convert it into housing as well. So it's almost as though with an issue this big, there's no one silver bullet. You've got to do 50 different things. So how do we encourage better use of land we already have? How do we unlock new land? How do we find ways of building more housing on existing land? And of course, that addresses the affordability issue too, right? What are more affordable, lower cost forms of housing? Right? Maybe smaller types of homes that people are still very happy to have. That's got to be an important step as well. So with the zoning, it's not just where the housing is going to go, but how do we help kind of push the right kind of housing to make sure that, your first time home buyer can actually find something in the market that they can afford.
What kind of role does council play in terms of finding space to get houses built after you've used up the green land and the brown land, and there's no land left to go? Where do you expand the borders of the city?
Great question. So, there's basically 2 things we could do. So the first is, yes, as you said, we could look to expand the borders of the city. That's a discussion. We have to go through a number of studies. We have to obviously do a community conversation about that. There's certainly sometimes a kind of a knee-jerk concern about that, which I think is valid, is we don't want to necessarily have endless suburban sprawl. We know the environmental and economic costs that come from that. So if we are looking at expansion, making sure that expansion itself, that there's enough new homes being concentrated in an area that we could still run transit routes and would still make sense to keep down our environmental footprint. So that's one thing we could do. We could look to expand outward. The other thing we look to do is how do we intensify within? So that's how do we build up the core of the city? There's, you see some redevelopment of properties where maybe there was a single family home. Can it be split in 2? Could you build 2 homes on that same piece of land? Could you actually build a little bit higher? And of course, that's one of the big debates we've had in Kingston is what about height, certainly in the core of the city. So I think that all of those solutions have to be on the table. I think it's a mix, and I think you've got to create different types of housing because people are different, right? And different demographics, and people in different seasons of life are looking for different things. So you got to make sure you're creating a variety of housing that works for everybody that's looking for it.
Do you have a sense as to what kind of person is moving to Kingston to build the population? Or is traditionally a lot of us thought that Kingston was becoming a retirement haven, if you will.
Yeah.
What's the latest information that you have in terms of who's coming to town?
So it's interesting you say that. I don't think that we've ever had a challenge attracting retired individuals. We know that Kingston is a very, very popular retirement destination. What's changed, though, in the last few years is that we're starting to get an influx of other demographics, more diversity in our population, a big move from the Toronto area. And I think that's going to continue just because of the affordability gap. I mean, we look at how much house prices have risen in Kingston, and it's been dramatic, but they are still quite a bit lower than in the Toronto area. And I think that the pandemic has accelerated that, with the advent of remote or hybrid work, right? The number of people that now maybe don't have to be in the office 5 days a week. So suddenly, if they only have to be in the office once or twice a week, suddenly the option of selling their home in the Toronto area and moving here to Kingston and maybe just commuting, every now and then actually becomes far more attractive for them. And so certainly, my discussions with, local realtors, certainly at our peak last year, more than 50% of all new home buyers were coming from the Toronto area. So, and that's a big pool of people looking to buy housing here. So I think that that's going to continue. And so again, how do we manage, the increase in the supply of housing to make sure that we can accommodate that growth, but also make sure that people that are already here aren't priced out of the market as a result. And that's obviously a big concern for me.
One of the things about apartment living in Kingston and finding apartments is the fact that the vacancy rate is really low. I think it's the lowest in the province, if I remember a news story that was on a little while ago. Again, I refer back to the fact that I've been here since 1966 and I've driven down the main drag, Princess Street, a bajillion times. And now when I drive down in a section from, and I don't know which, it's called Williamsville.
Yep.
The apartment buildings on that stretch, which is leading right into the downtown, has become phenomenal in terms of the number of buildings. My guess is a lot of it is to accommodate students who go to Queen's. And I don't know who else are living in those apartments. I know there's construction still going on.
Yep.
What's the thinking behind all of those apartments in that reasonably short stretch of road?
So you're absolutely right. So definitely a big growth in the number of new rental housing available, which is critical. So your point on the vacancy rate is bang on. So Kingston's vacancy rate is, I think it's second lowest. We're just a little bit above Peterborough, I think, this year. Canada as a whole, by the way, rental vacancy rate across the country is at its lowest point in 20 years. So you can see that this rental housing problem is not even just unique to Kingston. We're seeing it all over. However, what's driving it? Definitely growth in the university, growth in our post-secondary population. So again, good example of if we're not seeing an increase in rental housing, that pushes more and more pressure on our rental market. In fact, that was one of the things that was noted in the report on our vacancy rate, is our vacancy rate would be even lower if it wasn't for the fact of all those new apartment buildings that have been built. So I think it's definitely students. I wouldn't say it's exclusively students. We're certainly, I think there is a market for young professionals as well that are, wanting to kind of work and live in the downtown core. The other market that I'm seeing, and certainly this applies more to a couple of other apartment buildings that I know are slated for construction here in the downtown, are seniors. So there are a number of seniors that, maybe they have a larger home in the West End, looking to downsize, and, some are very interested in kind of that, walkable, right, shift to a more downtown living. Not for everybody, but for a number of seniors, that's been very attractive as well. So it's interesting, right? Even in that rental market, we're seeing, different groups looking for different things. And I think if we can try to accommodate as much of that as we can, I think that that's important.
When you mentioned seniors wanting to move out of their big home that they don't need anymore, that's pretty close to home. Having looked for an apartment in the last year.
Yeah.
One of the things that you and I talked about 4 years ago, and it's the first time I heard the phrase used, and that's downtown intensification. The business, and you have alluded to it already, the business of bringing people downtown so that they don't need a second car, so that they can shop in stores downtown and keep those stores viable. Yeah. Is that still something that's on your agenda these days?
It absolutely is. And if anything, I would say that it's become more urgent than it was 4 years ago. the reason why I say that is that the pandemic has really created, or really the post-pandemic has created a real challenge for the downtown core. So because of the rise of remote work and hybrid work, you're not getting as many people commuting into the core of the city to work during the day, right? So you think about that influx and how important that influx of people is, right? During the day, they might go out for lunch at a restaurant. At the end of the day, they might go shopping in a store downtown and then head home. But if they're not coming into the core of the city to begin with, right, then you're losing that.
That doesn't happen.
Exactly right. Yep. And so when I talk to restaurant owners, retailers in the downtown, what they're saying is, evenings and weekends, are still pretty good. And, certainly during the summer and the peak tourist months. But during the day, during the week, particularly like in a January, February, and March, it's slower. So I think if anything, it just shows the greater importance to have more residents living in the downtown core of the city in order to make sure that it's still viable to have a restaurant or to have a store on downtown Princess Street. So if anything, I think there's a greater urgency there. I think that involves both housing and also looking at, okay, what are other sorts of things we can invest in that can, increase foot traffic in the core of the city. I live out in the West End, and I think the suburban areas are healthy and growing because of how many people are now living in the suburban areas of the city. We want to make sure that we have that balanced growth, so we also see a growth of residents in the downtown.
Let's switch topics and talk about another issue that's been quite in the news a lot, and that's homelessness in the community. Explain to our audience, and I imagine this applies to communities almost anywhere, is the folks who are homeless at the moment how would you describe them in terms of why they are homeless? Are there categories that you would?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is that, every person's circumstance is unique. And so I'm always, and I think it's important never to try to categorize everybody in a cookie cutter way, because there are always, everyone has a unique story that's brought them to where they are at. Having said that, one thing that I can say in general is that as a city, homelessness has changed from what it was a number of years ago. It used to be primarily a housing issue. Now I would call it primarily a healthcare issue. It's healthcare and housing combined, because you can imagine, the trauma and what people have been through. It's not just a lack of housing that often then can create, whether it's mental health or addiction issues. So sometimes it might have been a mental health or addiction issue that led to a loss of housing. Sometimes it was a loss of housing, and as order to cope with the trauma of that led into mental health and addictions. And so the average, or I would say the vast majority of people that we now have in our homeless population, they need support on a number of different levels. They don't just need a roof over their heads, that's important, but they also need additional supports to help them with whatever other health, mental health, or addiction issues, whatever that might be, that's connected to that. And if you only try to solve one problem at a time, it won't work. You really need a holistic approach. That's why as a city, we've been working so hard on supportive housing. And for those that don't know, supportive housing is basically that housing with those supports. So it's a place to live, but it's also staff supports with people there for whatever you might need to kind of get back on your feet and overcome whatever other health or mental health or addiction issues you have, be able to work through that as well. That, I think, is going to be the key solution. And that's a far more expensive, complex and difficult solutions than it used to be, which was just opening up new shelter beds or, just making sure that we were just, building more housing in general. That's not going to work now. We need different solutions.
What's council's role in all of this in terms of developing the housing? For instance, you have a couple of different approaches. One of them is the group home idea. The other is tiny houses, or whatever the terminology is, but there are several of those around town. What's council's role in all this?
Well, that's a great question. So my view is that the city should play a role, but cannot solve the issue by itself. cities were designed based on property tax revenue. Cities were designed to take care of roads and parks and transit and those garbage collection and snow plowing, right? Those were always the bread and butter of what cities were meant to take care of. Cities were never designed to be able to address and solve issues around healthcare and homelessness and mental health and addictions and this whole web that I've just described. So we can play a role, and probably our best role, I think, is on the property side, right? That's what we do. That's our bread and butter. That's what we know. That's what we understand. So we've been very good at being able to identify a property that might work as supportive housing. We're even willing to spend money. We've actually gone out and bought those properties. But at that point, we need help because, first of all, we don't have the staffing or the ability to be able to operate a supportive housing. We don't have the funding to be able to necessarily renovate, a building and be able to make it into the supportive housing that's required. So this is where you require those complex partnerships, assistance with upper levels of government that are absolutely critical. And every supportive housing project that we've brought online, it's been the same formula, and I think it works well. It's been an investment by the city to locate, maybe even buy a property, but then you need generally money from upper levels of government to renovate, to refit, to design properly, and then most importantly, to operate. Because you need to pay those staff, right? There needs to be that oversight and running of supportive housing. It's not just building an apartment building and you walk away, right? This is a very, very ongoing, complex, critical care that requires staffing expertise, and that's really comes, I think, primarily from the provincial government level. So that's where, as a city, we play a role, but we can't do it ourselves.
What kind of not reaction is not the word I want. What kind of feedback do you get from your counterparts who are mayors in other communities across Ontario or across the country on this particular issue? Do you have some folks that are following the pattern that you've suggested here? Or are there other people who are thinking outside the box and trying something that's completely different?
I would say that, first of all, every one of my counterparts is feeling exactly the same way that I am, that we are trying to solve and address a very difficult, complex problem without the tools to be able to do it. Mm-hmm. So I think where the innovation that you're suggesting comes in is just how do you do that, right? So, for example, a couple of years ago, it was Kitchener. That there was an innovative solution that kind of bubbled up. It was called a better tent city. So it was basically a reaction to the concerns about, encampments of people living in tents. And basically an idea for sleeping cabins, right? A collection of sleeping cabins that then is overseen by, a community group, and basically is kind of, definitely a big improvement on an encampment, and then is used as a stepping stone to try to get to someone into more permanent housing. Well, that actually ended up leading us here in Kingston to do the same thing. So we now have a sleeping cabin project that was basically modeled on what we saw happening in Kitchener. Mm-hmm. So I think that we're always comparing notes, to be honest, on what is everyone doing. We've taken an innovative approach with the integrated care hub. Right, this is a low barrier shelter with wraparound services for some of our homeless and vulnerable residents. And a lot of cities have inquired with us about how did we do it? What does it look like? Because they're now looking to see, can they do the same thing in their cities? So you know what, it's comparing notes, but I will say this. We are all of the same mind, and we are all concerned that this is an issue that is falling to municipalities. We cannot fix it. We have tried to band together and are doing that right now to really compel the provincial government to come to the table with a larger strategy about how we can address this issue more effectively.
Switch topics again and talk about climate change. Mm-hmm. We talked about green space a little while ago and using it to build new housing on. The other thing that seems to be popular and seems to be top of mind with a lot of folks, and that's electric vehicles and converting themselves to that kind of vehicle. And my question is, do we have the infrastructure to charge those vehicles? I know that a lot of apartment buildings don't have the ability to do that. I know there are some around the university. I imagine there are some around the city. What's the plan with respect to the infrastructure to accommodate electric vehicles?
Well, I mean, I guess the quick answer to your question about whether we have the infrastructure to do it right now, the answer is no. But the follow-up is that we're working on it. So I think that the issue is to be proactive here. We all see the transition that is occurring. We all know where we're going. I mean, certainly as a city, our plan is to eventually have a 100% electric fleet of buses and other city vehicles. So we're obviously working in that direction. The issue is really two things. Number one, making sure that there's enough electricity generated for the city. And so that's something that we're obviously talking with the province about. The second piece is once you get the electricity here, you have to distribute it. So I actually, as part of my role as mayor, I sit as the chair of our local hydro distributor. And basically that's all about, creating the transformer stations and then connecting that to the lines that actually gets that electricity to all the new homes and all the new business parks and everywhere it needs to go. And making sure that that can also then feed all of the charging stations that will be required. And obviously I think we're just hitting just the cusp of what that's going to look like. Even for doing a complete conversion of our transit fleet to electric requires a whole new infrastructure of charging stations for buses. So it's one thing to bring our first couple of electric buses online, but if we want to bring on another 5, 10, 15, we're going to have to completely reinvent what our transit hub looks like. So I think that the issue is to start working on it now. If we wait for 5 years, it's going to be too late. So right now, we're actively working on a plan for a whole new transformer station with an absolute intention of a big increase in the amount of electricity we're going to have to use in the coming years.
As a taxpayer of the city, I'm curious to know where the money's coming from. If we're talking about the city going out and buying property on which to build houses, or looking for money to create some more hubs for those who are homeless in town, or setting up infrastructure for electric vehicles, whether they be the cities or the general publics. How does the city generate? Because in my mind, that's a lot of cash that has to be pulled together. And is it something that will involve taxpayers paying more taxes, or the provincial or federal government's kicking in more cash? What's your view on where that's going to end up?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to have to be a combination of things, to be honest. But on the tax front, you're right. I mean, I think that there's lots of investments that need to come, and that's where I think you need to harness the advantage of a growing city. And what I mean by that is that, if we talk about the property behind the RioCan Center that's being converted into housing. Well, all of those houses, right, will be new dwellings that will generate property taxes for the city. So that's new revenue and new growth that then comes to the city, which then helps to fund some of the other investments that we need to make in whether it's in transformer stations for our electric network, although that's really paid more out of rates, but all the other things that are required for infrastructure. So I think that this is what I would say is critical. So I've always been a pro-growth mayor, and I'm pro-growth for a reason. First of all, I think it has to be done smartly, but if you do it smartly, it's the growth that actually generates the revenues you need. And that takes pressure off of the existing taxpayer. So I'll give you an example. In last year's budget, our tax rate increase was 2.3%. But if we hadn't have had growth, it would have been up over 4%. So what happened? Well, because of all the growth and the new property taxes that come from new development and new housing, that actually brought in a lot of additional revenue that helped us to be able to deal with some of our other city expenses. That means you don't have to ask for as much from existing taxpayers. I think that's a really important model. Obviously, there are caveats. You got to be careful about how you grow. And there are ways that you can grow that actually are a financial advantage to the city, but there's other ways you can grow that actually create more of a drag and more expense for the city. So you have to be careful how you do it. But I think that's a critical piece for us, certainly with the pressures we're seeing on our costs in the next few years.
Following up on that point and going back to the conversation you and I had 4 years ago, I can remember us talking about how you communicate with the citizens of Kingston. Do you think, given the voter turnout in the last election, which was 30.56%, if I remember correctly, referring to my notes, not a big turnout.
Yep.
Do you think people understand what's going on? Do you think people are interested in municipal government? And if not, how do you generate more interest among the electorate to get involved?
That's a great question. So I don't think anybody would be happy with the 30% turnout. I certainly wasn't. Believe it or not, our turnout was high compared to many other municipalities. So I think we're clearly seeing a larger societal problem here. And I think we spent a lot of time talking about what's driving that. Obviously, also a record low turnout in the provincial government election last year. But I think that what we can do as a city, and I think this is really important, is to engage citizens in ways that are convenient for them. Right? I mean, I think we all have to recognize that in the modern world, people are busy. They're focused on their own lives. And, I give this example. It used to be that, when we wanted input from the public, we would have a public meeting at City Hall, which is crazy, right? I mean, expecting people to have the time, the energy, you're not coming down to a public meeting at City Hall unless you're really, really interested in that topic. I think it's much better to go to where people are, right? And so I'll never forget the example of Calgary when they were looking to do a survey on transit use and how to improve their transit. Well, they did the survey on a bus where people actually already were using the city service. And I think that, I think obviously we've adopted that as well. We've learned from that. And so a lot of our engagement is now more going to where people are at, engaging with their daily lives and saying, okay, well, this is what you're doing. How can we make things better? How can we teach you about, this is how city services work, and this is why you should care about them. I think we still have more work to do on that, but I think it does it's a new way of thinking about communication in a way that works for people. And obviously that's everything from embracing social media, and other new and creative ways of communicating. I mean, I used to do a lot of my communication in print where I would, put something out on my website in print. Now I use videos. Because you know what? That's just how people consume information now. Yeah. So I'll do short videos on YouTube. And I think that it's all about how do we keep the message simple? How do we make sure we can get those key points and educate people, but at the same time engage them where they're at?
We talked about this a little earlier. 8 new councillors on City Council, 4 returning plus you. How does that come into play with respect to how you conduct your responsibilities with so many new people on council?
I mean, there's definitely more of a mentorship role this time around. So, I remember what it was like when I first was elected to city council. It's an enormous learning curve. There's so much to absorb. The city touches so many different spheres now. And if anything, I think it's just gotten that much more complex over the last 8 years. So just understanding it takes some time to climb the learning curve. So for me, it's mentorship. It's being available for discussion. So that's both, when we meet as council, and sometimes it's just individual, sitting down and answering questions, giving advice wherever I can to help people kind of get their feet with the job. But it's also two-way. It's not just me mentoring them. I see a real value in what they're bringing to the table because they're seeing issues in a different way, right? Sometimes when you've sat around this table for a while, you see the issue one way, but sometimes an outside perspective, there's a fresh perspective that's really, really important. And so, it's not just that they're learning from me. I think I'm learning from them. And I think that that's actually what's helping to create a cohesive team, which is really important. Mm-hmm. With the issues that we're dealing with right now, I've never felt more strongly about this. We cannot afford to be, fighting bitterly with each other and, a divided and angry council, arguing on different issues. We really have to work quickly to find common ground, appreciate diverse perspectives. Yeah, we may not always agree, but challenge each other's perspectives in a way that hopefully we make the best possible decisions as we move forward. I think that's critical. So I think that, it's a good group, good team of people, and certainly I'm enjoying working with them. But, there's definitely, there's no time to climb the learning curve. We're having to deal with these complex issues right out of the gate. And so everything I can do to help support them with that, I think that's key.
Well, I know you have a lot of work ahead of you. You're a busy guy, and I appreciate the time you have given us today, and all the best going forward.
Well, thank you very much. A real pleasure to have a conversation.
My guest in this episode, the Mayor of Kingston, Ontario, Bryan Paterson. I spoke with Bryan at his office in City Hall. Thank you for listening. We'll talk soon.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.